Ashley Rogers. I'm the executive director of the Whitney Plantation, and I am so pleased today to reintroduce our Whitney Plantation Book Club, which is something we started many years ago, and we're just restarting it today. And we're happy to be joined by this book's author, Lee Hawkins, who will be talking about his book, I Am Nobody's Slave. So I hope that many of you have had a chance to read the book, but if not, that's okay. We're going to get into it and talk a little bit about it. Lee and I chatted about this book the other day, and I'm paraphrasing exactly what he said, but he said that writing this book was an act of love. And I think if you have read the book, you know that there's a lot of pain embedded in this work, but it's also a profound expression of love and care. Um, I Am Nobody's Slave begins in Hawkins' own life, describing the abuse he suffered in his family of origin, as well as the profound connections he felt to his parents and his siblings. And in the second half of the book, Hawkins probes at his family's history, uncovering the ways that inherited trauma informed his own life. As Hawkins shows, the history of slavery is not too distant from the present day. Many of us are only 3, 4, or 5 generations removed from enslaved people or enslavers. In 2016, just as an example, I personally gave a tour of Whitney Plantation to a woman whose father was enslaved. There are many people who are with us today who have living memories of people who survived slavery. But there are even more people alive today with living memories of the Jim Crow period, which still has not received the full attention it deserves. And too often, the story of Jim Crow is overlooked and downplayed. We talk about water fountains and buses and diners, all of which were significant, but the iniquities of American apartheid run much deeper than that. There are aspects of this era in American history that are vastly understudied, including indentured servitude of Black children, violent and forcible land loss, unequal worker protections, and public health crises. And all of these are events that touched Hawkins' own family. He also emphasizes that many members of his family met with violent ends and that children bore witness to this violence from an early age. We did not understand PTSD until relatively recently, but Hawkins shows that clearly many members of his family, dating back over 100 years, went through events on the adverse childhood experiences scale, greatly contributing to negative outcomes later in life. And based on our knowledge now, we can understand that many people in the past likely suffered from PTSD based on the violence of slavery and Jim Crow. Intergenerational trauma has become an increasing area of concern in recent years, and I think Hawkins' book is an important contribution to this study. So without further ado, I want to welcome Lee Hawkins. Lee is a Pulitzer Prize finalist and a former Wall Street Journal reporter who's a 5-time winner of the National Association of Black Journalists Salute to Excellence Award. He is also the creator of an acclaimed podcast, What Happened in Alabama, which was named the best podcast of the year by The Guardian. From 2023 to 2024, he was a Rosalind Carter Fellow for Mental Health Journalism, and he is a vocal advocate for truth-telling, racial healing, and national reckoning. So thank you so much, Lee Hawkins, for joining us today.
Glad to be here. Thank you so much, Dr. Rogers.
I am so excited to get into this book, and I just want to start by just saying that it was a really remarkable read, very, very powerful read, and I want to thank you for bringing these personal stories in such a vulnerable way to your audience.
Thank you so much.
So I'd just like to start sort of generally. How did you begin this process? You told me just a minute ago you were working on this 10, 11 years ago. So how did you kind of begin the journey of writing this book?
I always had a curiosity about my family's history in America from the time I saw the movie Roots. I remember watching the movie Roots and seeing the journey of Kunta Kinte, particularly in that scene where he was being whipped for refusing to take the name of the enslaver, I believe the Waller family. And at that time, I saw a window into modern times because I recognized how pervasive the belt was and how common the belt was in my childhood and in the childhood of so many other Black kids that I knew in my neighborhood and in my church community and everything. And it was I didn't call it abuse. because I saw it more as normalized violence. But when I looked at the Roots movie as a very young child, I started to see it in a different way. I started to see it as something that seemed to be tied to this imperative that Black parents and Black families felt that Black boys needed to follow the rules of the prevailing society in the same way that Kunta Kinte was expected to take the colonizer's name. And so that planted the seed because my father was from Alabama, Jim Crow apartheid Alabama, and he would never talk about his time in Alabama. And so sometimes he would have nightmares, as a matter of fact, and I would ask him, Dad, what were you dreaming about? And he would just say Alabama. We were very close. My father was an omnipresent father who loved me a great deal. And so that made it so much more confusing why discipline was the belt was such a big part of it. And then there were other parts of my family life that made me also very curious as to whether or not some of that had to do with Alabama. This whole concern, if we don't discipline you, the police will kill you. And, these concerns about if you go to that party and get in trouble, it wasn't just that you would get in trouble, it was that you would actually the whole family could be hung. And so I had the sense that there were traumatic things that had happened in Alabama that touched my father in such a tender place that he couldn't even discuss. And that was when I started to get interested in knowing more. And as I became a journalist, as a matter of fact, when I was a young collegiate journalist, not a very good one, I'll tell you that much, we went to Alabama finally, because my father wouldn't go back for many years. And we interviewed an uncle who was 93. And to build on what you said earlier, he was talking about his grandmother, who I later found out, because he didn't tell us, was in the last generation in my family to be enslaved. My great-great-grandmother, Charity Pugh, who lived in bondage for 30 years, and then Jim Crow for 60 years. And so the key here, just to wrap this up, is that he talked about the brutality of his childhood with regard to the dogs, and at Grandma Charity's hands. And so that kind of planted the seed. And as soon as Ancestry.com blew up, it enabled me to finally, for myself and also for my father, to dig into history and to go back 400 years. I took a DNA test and found out that 20% of my DNA was connected to a white family from that originated from Wales. So I ended up contacting them, building a relationship with them and going into the records. And so how I got involved and why it took 10 years was because this is an exhaustive investigation. And it's one of the few I know in which a Black person isn't just speaking with distance about slavery and how we think that slavery affected us, but this is generations, multiple generations, going back 5 generations. As a matter of fact, back to the 1600s, and showing how that affected one Black family and one Black boy's life. And I guess the last thing I'll say on that, which is very important, is that normalized violence was connected. As I started to go through, I started to understand that the abuse of my childhood was not necessarily from my parents, even though they were the ones who used the belt, and all the people in the community we knew who used the belt. The abuse of my childhood came from my country. And we can go into that, but we have to understand the connection to colonization. And what this did for me was to, in clear view, first help me understand that we knew the people who were enslaved because they were our family members, who my grandmother and my grand uncle, who we talked about, knew. And two, that we don't have to go back to my great-great-grandparents. We can go back to my father. I'm a first generation American, which means that even though my family members who have been here since the 1600s, I'm the first to be born equal to a white person. And my father wasn't. And so what that was not segregation, it was apartheid.
Hmm.
And because I found out that I had family members murdered every generation since 1837, I realized in my investigation that Jim Crow was not just segregation. It was apartheid and a crime against humanity in which many, many thousands, if not millions, of Black people had close relatives murdered and were left for generations to grieve. And that racial equality is a new concept in America because it's only been 60 years that Black people and people of color have been considered equal to white people in America. So this is why we're having this struggle and why this history is so difficult for people to accept and why we see this war on American history being taught honestly and a war and a fear of books.
There's so much to think about, but I think that the violence is such an important theme in this book, and I think that I've thought for a long time we don't talk very well about lynching in this country, and that's starting to change, right? So we have EJI in Alabama, and there are a lot of people having conversations about lynching for the first time in any kind of real meaningful public way. But I think that what you also talk about in this book is not just lynching. The violence is not just that. It's also there are many other people who meet these violent ends that stem from, those same issues of inequality. And I think about what happened to your great grandfather when you talk about Grandpa Ike. And that story is so common about, the forcible removal from land, or, the killing of the head of the family over perception that maybe that person has gotten above their station. Maybe they have something that they don't deserve because of this strict racial separation in apartheid era America. So I think that pervasive violence that you talk about is also so significant in forming these children's worldview. Because the other thing you talk about in the book is that it's not just that you have these people who have met these violent ends, but so often, as you described, there are children there present who saw it, you know. And I think that you bring up this idea a few times throughout the book. I wonder if you could talk to the audience a little bit about it, about the adverse childhood experiences, and kind of what that is and how we might think about people from the past, looking at people living through Jim Crow and slavery, and considering those sort of adverse childhood experiences.
Thank you, Dr. Rogers. And, I haven't had a chance to go to the Whitney Plantation. My sister, Tiffany, went, and she told me that she felt that it did such a good job of helping people understand how children were affected by the enslaved children were affected by slavery. And so, if we think about it in those terms, we have 12 generations of Black American family members who lived through slavery, and then another 5 generations who lived through Jim Crow apartheid all the way up to 1964. And of course, those periods were filled with trauma for anybody who was in bondage or anybody who was living under a system where white supremacy was the law, and if they were Black, of course. And I think that so everything that I've been able to learn as a researcher and a student about childhood trauma, I has really helped me because I first thing that I did was I studied the adverse childhood experience, the study that was done by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention uh, and Kaiser Permanente, and the first iteration of it was in 1996, and it actually used predominantly white suburban children, and
Mm.
it came up with this theory or with the proof that if children have 4 or 5 childhood trauma events, stressors in their childhood, they can grow and on average potentially die 20 years earlier than expected of heart attack, diabetes, or cancer, primarily due to the stress toxins that can infiltrate our body and make us sick. And so that really learning about that study and delving into that study really started to make me curious because I was thinking, wow, if this is white children, I can only imagine what Black and Brown children have experienced historically in this country, and so and how it has affected our families, and does this have anything to do with life expectancy? And as we saw in the subsequent years, they started to add Black children and brown children into the study group and found a disproportionate share of them indeed have been affected by it. And I struggled in my own life many years later when I started having my own nightmares around the same time that my father had his when I was a kid. And those nightmares profoundly dealt with corporal punishment of my childhood, the use of the belt, and how the belt was seen as once again normalized. And it was a very loving gesture, this idea we do this because we love you, we do this to protect you. And I think that contradiction and that complexity behind that was what my brain was able to process and accept, but my body revolted. And so during that period, and you'll see in the book, because this book is really not just me standing on a soapbox and giving my opinion on things. It's a story of a Black boy from 0 to 17, as you said in your introduction. And then also it goes into the way that the history affected that upbringing. So then we get to see that through the generations, how my great great grandparents and how my grandparents and my great grandparents, uh, what their childhoods were like. And we were able to piece those together to show this childhood trauma that led to the fate of people, the flurry of people in my family who died early um, of different illnesses, but not understanding the role that Jim Crow played, the homicidal role that Jim Crow played in slowly killing people. I mean, it's amazing that Grandma Parody lived into her 90s after all that she had gone through, but her son, as you mentioned, was murdered, and the whole story in that murder is in the book. And my grandmother, Opie, was only 9 when her father was killed, and she witnessed the bloody, not the attack, but the aftermath. And her father, coming home all bloody on a horse with his feet still in the stirrup. That was a haunting scene. And it would have been haunting for my grandfather, her husband, whose father was killed when he was 5, and his body was left in a wagon in front of the house after he was killed. And so, of course, then I started to understand how all of this shaped my father's and my mother's role in what they felt their role was in raising me. My father was, and I hate to call it complex PTSD because the post implies that it ever ended, and it never ended for my father. And the thing is you would never know it because he was a gregarious, strong, powerful, beautiful man. This is probably one of the most handsome men I've ever seen. I don't know what happened to me, but people loved him, and I think that me as well. People would never begin to think about the trauma that has been in my bloodline intergenerationally, just from the way I carry myself and all of the success that we've all had as a family. And so I think that the childhood trauma aspect of it is left for the Black person to deal with. And in my case, I had nightmares, I had brain fog, and I was able to come up with modalities to address it. But the first thing that I had to do was to confront my parents to start to begin to understand this process and how it was that I ended up getting the belt over 150 times as a kid. And then later understand and study through the prism of the ACEs study and also the ways that ACEs can be addressed because it doesn't have to be a death sentence. I was able then to start understanding the symptoms I was having and what it was going to take for me to let go of this hypervigilance that I felt. And I just want to explain this last thing. Um, Corporal punishment is legal in 17 states. It's primarily the states where slavery was legal. So once again, the states who engaged in the treason against our country and have always tried to hold us back from the liberty and justice for all ideal are still beating children. And disproportionately, it affects Black and brown children and children with special needs. Still to this day, and a lot of people don't know that. I think it's important for people to know. It's not in every county, but there are schools that are still, particularly in Mississippi, where that are still beating kids on average 15 times per student. So if you can imagine what that would be like to go through your school year and be paddled 15 times, I mean, it would be very difficult to concentrate. And in my book, I tell the story of being that little boy, having difficulty in math class for a time because of this idea that every time I got a bad grade, I would get spanked at home, right? And then that there were things that were happening to me at school as well at the hands of my teachers. And the whole idea is to help people understand that while we think that the worst of corporal punishment and the use of hitting children is just that it hurts temporarily. The truth is that that idea of not knowing what's going to happen next and when the next beating is going to come, it creates an effect that if that you can never get calm. You can never just rest. That if you make a mistake over here, if you violate a rule over there as an adultified Black child, that's going to come with a consequence. And it's just like an adult. If an adult could be woken up at any time at 2 a.m. and beat with a belt, it would bother them, and whoever did it would be sent to jail. But the truth is, children are the most vulnerable that have the least protection. And in my case, that whole idea of not knowing when the next punishment was going to be if I made a mistake, if I came home late, if I left my football outside, if I spent too much time playing a video game or something like that, that created this hypervigilance, which then can completely overwhelm your parasympathetic nervous system and the fight or flight parts of the brain and hardwire you if you've had this in your system for 18 years, right? Hardwire you for anxiety and also potentially set you up for disease because you've had cortisol and adrenaline and all of the toxic stress in your system for 18 years. And so this doesn't just apply to Black children. This applies to any child who goes through childhood trauma. If you've had stress toxins in your system for 18 years, you're halfway to a heart attack, stroke, or diabetes. And it was important to make these connections through the work, through the telling of the story. So the science is brought in the book, but it's woven in a way so that it's smoothly done, so the narrative flows, and it really reads more like, like a novel. And I think that was important to do it that way.
I think, you and I were talking about this the other day about about the hypervigilance and about the kind of living in that fight or flight response. And, unfortunately, one of the biggest things that's missing in the study of slavery, when we tell stories of people who were enslaved here at Whitney Plantation, we don't have their individual words. We don't have, there's no diaries, there's no letters, there's hardly anything left over that tells us what they thought, what they felt, what they saw day to day. But what we can do is kind of imagine what their lives may have been like. And it's something that I think about quite a lot, about that, the impact of that kind of constant stress, because it's one thing that in our conversation the other day, I was saying how, one of the ways that on a plantation, the owners of the plantation maintained social control, right? Control of a enslaved workforce of people who outnumbered them. You know, there's 2 people who own Whitney Plantation. There's over 100 who are enslaved here. So how do you control those people? They're not literally chained up most of the time. There's a social control. There's a way to control the population. And a lot of that is through violence, but it doesn't have to be direct violence. It can also be through threats of violence, and it can be through scaring people into thinking that at any moment, as you say, it could be 2 o'clock in the morning. You don't know when the next thing is going to happen. You don't know what is the point at which your child that you raise is going to be taken from you. You don't know, when that the lash is coming for not only yourself, but for your kid, your wife. And there's so little that you can control in that situation. And so if we understand that that was the norm in plantation slavery across the South, that's typical of what enslaved people experienced. It's hard to imagine that those people wouldn't have been carrying that kind of hypervigilance, that kind of trauma, around with them. And in that respect, if we're talking about 4 or 5 generations, it makes perfect sense that that would be passed down from generation to generation. So I think that's such an important kind of parallel to think about in terms of, the work that you've done and thinking about your own life and in these few generations, what got passed down. But we're talking about many generations, right? As you say, you've got family stretching back to the 1600s. So this is much more than 4 generations. This is 10, 12, 15 generations.
Yeah.
And one of the other things that you really emphasized is the influence of kind of that it's the intervention of colonialism, it's the intervention of slavery that creates this kind of trauma. There's this overarching theme that you talk about in the book about, well, this being normalized in Black families and this being part of some kind of a cultural experience, and you come to that over and over again. And then at the end of the book, you have this part where you talk about research into West African families. And can you talk a little bit about that? Because I want to kind of point at that sort of influence of colonialism.
Yes, thank you. And so, um, the in order to get at that, I had to realize that my father's grandmother was Grandma Charity, or yes, he was his great grandmother, and her son Isaac Jr. or Isaac Sr. was born into enslavement. So my father's grandfather was enslaved. And so when you think about how profoundly your grandparents can affect your socialization, that was very, very horrifically close to me. And to understand how that would have affected the way my father saw the world, I had to piece back to Grandma Charity's life. And I found the law that she lived under primarily was the Slave Code of Alabama of 1852, which governed every aspect of her life. So there was the life on the plantation and the plantation's rules, and then the life of the government, the governmental enforcement of life outside of the plantation. And it was hyper police. And so the one thing that I learned was that it wasn't police, however, who influenced and enforced these laws. It was actually a militia that required every white man between the ages of 18 and 45 to do 1 night a week of slave patrol. And so whether people's families owned enslaved people or not, everybody participated in the subjugation of Black people and also benefited from the subjugation of Black people, not just in the South, but also in the North because of the gross domestic product and the trillions in today's dollars that our people generated for this country. And so it was important for me to go back and to look at the origins of the use of the whip, because the use of the whip was how they enforced the slave code. So the slave code, let's give a couple examples of what the rules under the slave code were. If a Black person were caught reading or writing, it was 39 to 100 lashes. if black people were together having a meeting with a white person present, without a white person present, everybody in that meeting would get whipped by one of the local men who was on patrol that day doing with 39 or 100 lashes. If black people were wearing clothing of a certain value, they would be whipped for that, 39 to 100 lashes. If Grandma Charity was running an errand to go to the corner store, to the county store without a pass, 39 to 100 lashes. And when I went into the work, I found that the man who inherited her and enslaved her for the last part of her enslavement was actually first a blood relative of mine, a white man named Maxton Pugh, because of the legacy of sexual assault against our matriarch. And also he was the justice of the peace of Butler County, which meant that he oversaw all of the patrols and the whipping of every black person in the county. So she was living under the hostility of this man who was the controller of the controllers. And so going back to that started to help me understand why it was that my Uncle Ike, the son of her son, when we met him in 1991, was talking about mean old Grandma Charity and how Grandma Charity used to whoop us if we weren't working fast enough in the fields while she was supervising us when my daddy got his own job. Then I started to recognize, wow, he just presented her as crazy, but he didn't tell us that she was enslaved. When I found out that she was enslaved and I saw the conditions and the rules under which she was raised under, then I started to understand the rules that society was raised under. And I started to see the connection between the two, the same philosophical approach that these are the rules that you must follow. You're 8 years old, you have to be a man now, and you have to follow these rules, because if you don't, you will be killed. And what our job is to enforce the rules of the broader society in our living room in order to prevent you from doing that. And we're going to enforce that with the whip. And I think the parallel to this idea that this comes from Black culture is profound, because I just accepted that, and that was what I was told. And if you look at, certain comedians, Steve Harvey, even Nick Cannon, who did work with Nickelodeon of all places, have talked with a lot of bravado. I whip the children, black children. No black child is going to be able to talk back to me or have that confidence stand up to me and give his opinion. Not no damn child. What they would do is they make jokes about whipping and reinforce this idea that this was our creation. And when I went into the work, I was able to find that it wasn't our creation. It was the ancestors of Maxton Pugh brought over from Wales. And the United Kingdom used flogging. The United Kingdom used whipping to enforce the criminal justice system that they then created to be here in the United States. And that was what our ancestors lived under. And we adopted that. We adopted that as our own. We adopted foods that they would feed us, would force feed us, chitlins and all of the pork products and all of the things that were found to later be killing people and giving people heart attacks generations later. Didn't come from it. That wasn't our food. When I went back into the the practices, I started to see Dr. Stacey Patton and other experts who talked about black children being spiritually empowered people who had the love and the protection of the society. And to harm a child in a West African nation was something that did not happen, that did not happen. And when I looked at the diet was a plant food diet. It wasn't filled with all of that.
Ooh, Lee. 1 second. We're getting some feedback on your mic. I think the issue might be on the Bluetooth headphones. Do you want to
Me
try?
now?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
there we go.
I'm off the headphones
Okay.
now. And so what I was saying is the plant food diet. What I found was the plant food diet was our primary diet. It wasn't all of the sugar and the carbs and the sweet potato pies with all the sugar in it and everything. We didn't, that wasn't ours. That was their culture, and that was pushed on us. And then we adopted it, those of us who did, because I'm not saying all of Black families adopted whipping and all of these practices. Um, we adopted it as our own and taught our children for generations. This is our heritage. We beat you because Black people beat their kids. We eat chitlins on New Year's Eve because this is our ancestors' food. And all of these different things. When you go to school and be told that you're acting white because you got an A on a paper, that wasn't true. That was all rooted in the system that said that Black people should get 39 to 100 lashes if they're caught reading and writing. And what blew me away, Dr. Rogers, was just this understanding of how closely knit all of this was. And I had never really seen any academic or any journalist or any author anywhere that had actually taken the 10 years that it takes to do this and to go back into their history and actually draw these lines and make these connections. And so I thought it was important for me to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to make a note to the audience that if you do have questions for Lee Hawkins, we are going to leave a few minutes at the end for that. So you can put those in the chat, and I will ask him some of your questions that you might have. I want to also just ask you, what was the most surprising piece of your family's history that you uncovered in this process?
Um, well, I think the fact that we've had a murder in our family every generation since 1837, and that the all of the murders were not concentrated just on the side of those who were enslaved, that my ancestors who were enslavers suffered greatly as a result of their actions, that nobody got off free for enslavement and for, yes, there the two men who killed my great grandfathers, they were not brought to justice. As a matter of fact, they were acquitted, and one didn't go to trial and the other was acquitted in less than a few minutes, according to the Montgomery Advertiser. But they were both ultimately killed as well in very brutal ways. The family who enslaved my family took their land from the indigenous people, according to records, alongside the thousands of other people who did as well. But they were murdered by the indigenous people. Lewis Pugh was murdered by the indigenous people, and then he had another. He had a nephew who was named after him, who was murdered in 1889, allegedly by formerly enslaved people. And so there was always a cosmic debt to pay for all of the brutality that was waged against Black people. And even if you talk to, if I talk to family members on the white side who descend from the enslavers, one of them, at least my cousin Lloyd Pugh, who studies the Confederacy, who and says that it's not, in his view, he doesn't believe that he's embracing white supremacy, but that he's celebrating his heritage. You know, he was kind enough to open up centuries of records for me, so I was appreciative of that, but I knew I wasn't going to change his mind about the Confederacy. And one of the things that he and many others had talked about was how much the Confederacy lost and how many family members saw their houses burned to the ground, and family members who suffered for generations and in many ways still suffer today as a result of the decisions that were made to commit treason against the United States of America. And so I think the most surprising thing was that there was never there's never really any escape. And I think the most surprising thing was all of the things that I uncovered that my family went through and survived and thrived through, almost to the point that we walk around the world and people have no idea what we actually overcame in our lives. And I think that even today in writing this book, there are people who've known me all my life who've kind of feel like, oh, wow, I mean, you went through all of that. And it's starting to open up an understanding of them I think, it's difficult for people to process and to stomach that someone could be sitting across from a Black man could be sitting across from someone at the Wall Street Journal. Since I was there for 19 years, I'll use that as an example. But that Black man's parents were not born equal to a white person in America, but that other person sitting across from them's grandfather was the CEO of Goldman Sachs, and enslavers and people who for generations, still are spending money from 1850, right? But we're still in the same place. And I think that what my family overcame is profound. The number of people who we have who are, police chiefs and investment bankers and high school guidance counselors. I have a cousin who was just named a superintendent of the St. Paul Public School. And it's just for what our family overcame, and the fact that we led the civil rights movement. We were part of the people who led the movement to force America another step closer to being American by passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and just continued out of emancipation into Reconstruction, and then out of the Civil Rights Act, and just with the vengeance and with not a vengeance, but with vigor, pursued success and became successful, not always because of America, but very often despite America. And that really surprised me, because Black Americans are awesome in that sense. And we shouldn't be excelling to the extent that we are. But it's just amazing that we have overcome so much to the point that it looks like we haven't been through anything.
Wow. There's a lot in this book that it's clear. I mean, obviously you worked on this for 10 years. You start with these kind of little tiny pieces or clues maybe from your family, and then you sort of slowly unravel everything by doing oral histories and kind of asking questions over and over, and then doing a lot of research. But it's a huge process. And I know you also did DNA testing as well. There was a lot that went into this to uncovering the story. This is not a simple process. So it might be daunting, right? So what advice would you give to people who are just kind of starting to do, so interested in doing family research, but they maybe not know where to start?
Oh, Dr. Rogers, that's a wonderful question, because I want to encourage all of you to do this, whether it doesn't have to be a book, but I hope it is a book, because I want to learn your stories as well. I think it's important. Alex Haley said, when an elder dies, it's like a library burned down. So it's always important to reach out to the eldest people in your family and get them on tape as soon as possible. So that's one thing. And I think the other thing is to understand the extent to which genealogy is used to idealize family narratives, and try your best to back away from that. I see a parallel between three institutions that mean the most to me in this world. And one is my family, the other is my church, and the other is my country. I love all three of them, which means I want them to be the best that they can be. And so the only way for them to be the best that they can be is to confront the truth and to find the darkness and lean into the darkness. And then find the light and be proud of the light, but understand that two things and multiple things can be true about a country, about a church, about a family. We had slavery, but we had emancipation. We had Jim Crow, but we had apartheid, but we had the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And there wasn't a Black person in the Senate or the Congress when that was passed. And it was passed with a good old boy from Texas as the president. And so same thing in our church. There's many things. I spoke to the Jesuits a couple weeks ago, to the leadership of North American Jesuits in Canada, about their role in enslavement. And yes, they had a heavy role in enslavement, and now they're working on reparations, and they've also done a lot of good in this world. And the same thing applies to my family. Yes, my father was somebody who believed devoutly in the belt, but at the same time, he was an omnipresent man. There wasn't any time that I felt my father didn't love me. There wasn't any time that my father wasn't in my life. And so I think it's important for us to use this, not to just genealogy. Let's use genealogy not just to determine when someone was born and when they died. Like I know a lot of people who do genealogy through that prism, and they just go down this rabbit hole where they're looking at people and they're basically just building family trees. This process wasn't just building a family tree. This was finding where the stories were and where the threads were that would make this a compelling story and put things together. And so in order to do that, you have to have the darkness and the light, and you have to be able to, if you're going to write an American classic that outlives you, then you have to make sure that you have the tension in there that shows the love for your family and for your ancestors, so that you can show honestly what they went through, show their shortcomings and the things that we can be proud of. So you can break those cycles that are toxic and take the power and the resilience and all of the beautiful things forward. And that's the highest form of love that you can show for your ancestors, is to be honest and truthful. And it's also the highest form of love that we can show our country, which is why I believe censorship of American curriculums is anti-American. And it's those people who are doing that, they don't love this country.
Absolutely. I agree with you on that. I think that, I don't think that the work that I do is born out of a hatred of this country. I think that it's about love. You can't love something unless you fully understand it, and you have to fully understand all of the trauma from our past as well, Oh, you're muted.
The leaders we celebrate the most, Dr. King, Malcolm X, Lincoln, President Lincoln, President Jefferson or Thomas Jefferson, everybody who participated in the Constitutional Convention, they understood that they could not get the Constitution passed and abolish slavery. But the goal of this egalitarian document, this beautiful egalitarian document, was to push future generations, to push us to a more perfect union. And anybody who ever loved this country was honest about the darkness and the dark side of the country. I would say that Lincoln, and if you look at some of his speeches, and really look into that, he talks about the cosmic debt that we would have to pay, the spiritual debt that we would have to pay for the scourge of the Civil War. And he was pretty unrelenting about that. And I think that we need more people like that in this world that we're living in today, because we tend to sanitize family stories and sanitize the stories of the country, and it's not doing anybody any good.
I'm going to get to a few of our audience members' questions here if we have some time. We've got about 10 minutes left in this event. One question that some folks have had is, are you going to continue exploring your family's history? There is a section at the end where you say, you're not getting too far into your mom's side. That's maybe for another project. Are you are you interested in doing some more work on that, or is this going to be the end of your genealogy?
No, I definitely 110% you'll see more because it's almost unfair for me to imply that all of the challenge and the victory that my family endured happened in the South.
Mhm.
When we went north, there was a great deal. The murders continued, by the way, because of the zeal through which my ancestors pursued entrepreneurship and land ownership. Many family members were murdered as a result of that. And I've already done a lot of the work. A lot of the work is already done. I just couldn't include it in the book would have been 2,000 words or 2,000 pages long if I would have included it all. So yeah, there's a lot more to come. And I think I'll be very creative with the audio format in the way that I was with what happened in Alabama and also unlocking the gate. So you can check out at whathappenedinalabama.org. But yeah, this approach of telling a story of one American family will continue, and the next the next installment will likely have a lot to do with the family members in the North and what our migration from the South to the North entailed.
This is something that I kind of wondered about too. I was curious if you had, um, if there were changes that you'd like to see as a result of your research. And one of the people in the audience asked, how can you help parents understand the harm they are perpetuating through corporal punishment? Are you hoping for kind of broader changes through the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I think information is power is a cliche, but it's a cliche because it's so true. And knowledge is power, wisdom is power. And so a lot of my job in my advocacy, it's indirect advocacy, this storytelling. I never thought of myself as an advocacy journalist, and I still don't. But I think through the power of the stories and the objectivity of the stories, I'm able to help people draw their own conclusions to a lot of this. And I think that this will illuminate for the people who read this book the understanding that corporal punishment is damaging to children far beyond just what happens in the moment, but that you could be hardwiring your child for anxiety and for early death in the future. So yeah, I hope that I don't know if this will have an impact on corporal punishment in schools and the way that our government continues to commit violence against our children. And part of that, I'm going to be honest with you, is because it's been so deeply internalized by Black administrators as well in the South. And so it's really a cultural thing that ties into the violence of that's the founding of our country, right? Violence is just as American as a bald eagle. It's integrated into the foundations of our country. And so what I want to do is I want to help people start to change their thinking so that they start to realize that when we see mass shootings and when we see homicide crisis and we see all of the violence that's happening in the society, we have to understand that it's inextricably tied to the violence that started our country. And so that's one thing. And another change I would like to see is for America to finally come to terms, and this is not just the Republicans, but the Democrats as well, come to terms with and acknowledge the fact that there were 5 generations of African Americans who lived under Jim Crow apartheid, which is very similar to what South Africa in people lived under, and that it was not segregation, it was a crime against humanity. And 8 to 9 million people are living today who lived through Jim Crow apartheid. And so you'll see that my book is dedicated to Jim Crow apartheid survivors and their children and grandchildren, because I understand the intergenerational ripple effect of of living under Jim Crow was, and it's only been 60 years that that was not the law. And so we have to come to terms with the extent to which millions of people are walking around today who went through apartheid and have not even had the chance to even discuss it with their own families because they're still living on the site of terror where it happened. And the societal implications of that, and the question of how should injustices such as redlining and racial covenants and Jim Crow itself be dealt with, because I don't think that our country will ever be free or reach its potential until we are able to reckon with that truth and to reconcile and to bring acknowledgement about and change.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to read one final question. We have a teacher in our audience who says she has, or she or he has two students reading your book. When they finish, what is one message for them beyond what you've written?
I think the primary message is use this book to understand American history. There are a lot of books out there that are pontificating about people's perceptions and people's opinions on what American history is. This book is a story of one Black American family that will give you a very clear understanding of what Jim Crow was. And so I think if you finish this book as a student, oh my God, be excited, because now you understand a dimension of American history that probably far less than 5% of the American population understands, and maybe people globally understand it better than we do, because they're not coming into it with the bias that we were all taught in the beginning of our education, that, you know, the first lesson we learned was George Washington never told a lie about the apple tree. And it was downhill from there, because it taught us to never challenge our country and to never disbelieve anything that you're told about our country. And so that's what I would do. I would sit back and reflect on this American history that is really, really detailed, and see where you can see the legacy of Jim Crow and slavery in the society and how it holds us back. And I would want to thank the teacher. Thank you, whoever you are. I want to thank you for sharing my book with your students. I think this book, you know, and of course I'm biased, but I think this book really should be in the curriculums of every American school, K to 12, well, not K to 12, sorry, high school AP, 11th and 12th grade, and then every undergraduate sociology, history, African American studies and social work program and psychology program that we can get it into, because it just gives a devastating but truthful account of how the intersectionality of all of this and how all of it works together to affect people in modern times and help people understand how we as families, as individuals, and as countries, as a country and as citizens can get past the effects of the legacy of enslavement, Jim Crow, and integration trauma that's inherent in the colonial foundations of our republic. So yeah.
Thank you so much. We're gonna wrap up here. So again, for anybody who did not have a chance to look at the book yet, I Am Nobody's Slave by Lee Hawkins. And if you want to purchase a copy and haven't yet, you can do so on our website. We have an online gift store where we're selling the book. I just want to thank you so much, Mr. Hawkins, for spending all of this time with us and spending an hour on this Thursday afternoon. For me, that was a really enlightening talk, and I hope that everybody else really got a lot out of it as much as I got out of it. So thank you so much.
I want to thank the Whitney Plantation. The work you're doing is God's work. And I encourage everybody to go to the Whitney Plantation. And thank you, Dr. Rogers, for the beautiful work that you do and your lifelong commitment to this, because I can't think of a better American or a more American and patriotic thing to do is to study history and to share it with future generations.
Thank you so much. All right, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and thanks for joining us today.
LeeHawkinsJr.com is how you can reach me.
Yeah.
LeeHawkinsJr.com, and that's the mail address.
And Lee Hawkins has some upcoming events too. So if you're talking in Philly, right? Are we have Philly
Yeah,
people
June
here that can do
14th.
Philly time.
The Plymouth meeting, June 14th, Plymouth meeting, Barnes and Noble
There we
at
go.
I believe, yeah. So thank
All
you.
right. All
God
right,
bless
thanks.
everybody. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.